I'm Oliver Stone. Welcome to Exhuming JFK. To research the JFK assassination is to enter into a maze. For within the established narrative and assorted counter-narratives of the great American murder mystery are nested dozens, if not hundreds, of intersecting paths to truth and understanding. Avoiding the dead ends is important, as is not getting lost entirely. But for many, the first question is where to even begin.
I'm Dr. Cyril Wecht. In 2003, on the 40th anniversary of the assassination, and again in 2013, on the 50th anniversary, I was pleased to spearhead multi-day symposia hosted by my namesake institution, the Cyril H. Wecht Institute of Forensic Science and Law at Duquesne University. These conferences, the 40th entitled Into Evidence, and the 50th entitled Passing the Torch, each convened many of the case's leading experts to share their analyses of what transpired on November 22nd, 1963, and why. Now, I'm equally pleased to introduce you to a video podcast series that will explore many of the ongoing mysteries surrounding the murder of our 35th president, drawing on that very same expertise. Each viewer will be directed by his or her own areas of interest, and this series is designed to highlight all of them. We hope they stimulate your interest and motivate you to dig deeper. Welcome to Exhuming JFK. As a forensic pathologist practicing for 60 years, I have naturally been drawn to questions pertaining to the wounds sustained by President John F. Kennedy, and by his autopsy in particular. In this episode of Exhuming JFK, I shall offer you a brief overview of key aspects of the medical evidence in this assassination, as it progressed from Dealey Plaza to Parkland Memorial Hospital to Bethesda Naval Hospital and beyond. And in the accompanying video segments, you will get a glimpse of just how much more there is to learn. When JFK was struck, various biological matter was distributed from the blood and brain tissue sprayed onto Jackie's pink suit to a skull fragment later found in the grass nearly 120 feet away. Much of this evidence, of course, was transitory in nature, meaning that it could not be physically salvaged and recovered, while other materials were no doubt lost through pre-CSI era carelessness, not to mention at a time when we knew nothing of DNA's role in forensic identification. But among those materials which were recovered and documented were such critical pieces of evidence as the controversial Harper fragment, described here by radiation oncologist and physicist Dr. David Mantik at the Wecht Institute's 40th anniversary conference at Duquesne University, Into Evidence.
The Harper bone fragment. Detailed analysis of the skull x-rays permitted this reconstruction. Most likely the Harper fragment lay here at the right rear. The only other possible location was offered by Dr. Angel, the anthropology expert for the HSCA, who placed it in the parietal area as shown here. However, he did not know that the occipital bone was missing, so this site at the top of the head was his only option. My reconstruction suggests that this parietal area of the skull was missing, so Angel made a reasonable guess. The chief argument against him is that the lead smudge on the Harper fragment, listen to John Hunt, lies on the outside, not on the inside. That suggests an entry site, not an exit site. The sequential deductions that led to my selected site yielded, quite coincidentally, a location for the lead smudge that exactly matched the entry site as described by the autopsy pathologists. To this day, that remains one of the most extraordinary events in my journey. I did not try to make that happen. On the other hand, Angel's site implies a parietal entry because the smudge is on the outside, an option that virtually no one would support. So why does any of this matter? If the Harper fragment derives from the rear, this suggests a large exit hole at the rear, consistent with a shot from the front.
From Dealey Plaza, the presidential limousine sped on to Parkland Memorial Hospital. There, of course, the primary mission was to do everything possible to save the dying president's life. But in the process, many key observations were made. Here is the late Dr. Robert McClellan, a member of the Trauma Room 1 surgical team, discussing a critical observation while speaking at the Wecht Institute's 50th anniversary symposium, Passing the Torch.
Pushed the door to Trauma Room 1 open and walked in. I was immediately confronted by the terrible scene of the president lying on his back on a gurney with his head lit up with an operating room light, his bloody head lit up with an operating room light. I passed on into the room and walked by the left side of the gurney and saw that I was not the only faculty person there in surgery. Instead, Dr. Malcolm Perry and Dr. Charles Baxter had immediately preceded me into the room. And they were just about to begin to explore a wound in the president's neck. There was a small wound, Dr. Perry pointed out to me, in the right side of the president's neck, just above the clavicle and just to the right side of the president's trachea or windpipe. And Dr. Perry said, Bob, we're going to make an incision through this wound and explore to be sure that the carotid artery is not injured, and also to replace the endotracheal tube that had been put into the president by Dr. Carrico as soon as the president was brought into the emergency room. And so in order to help them do that, Dr. Perry handed me a surgical retractor and asked me to go to the head of the gurney and lean over the president's head and put the retractor in the incision that they were making to explore this wound. So I moved into that position immediately above the president's head, about probably a foot and a half above a huge injury that I saw in the back of his head as soon as I got into position at the head of the gurney that the president was lying on. And I told Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter, I said, my God, have you seen this huge wound in the back of his head? And they said, no, we just walked in just like you did, and all we saw was this small wound in his neck. And I said, well, the whole right side of his skull is gone, and I can look inside his skull cavity and see that the back half of his cerebrum has been blown out. And as I stood there, and just as I said that, the right half cerebellum fell out of the gaping wound in the back of his head onto the gurney.
Also in the room was the late Dr. Robert Grossman, then a neurosurgical resident, who would later make recollective drawings for the Assassination Records Review Board, as he discusses here.
So throughout the years, I received many inquiries about what I saw that day, but I almost always declined to answer them. An exception was a telephone interview with Ben Bradley of the Boston Globe, who included my comments in an article published in the Globe in June 21st, 1981. And Mr. Bradley described the discrepancies in the testimony and the autopsy findings regarding the location of the president's wounds. It was a synopsis of interviews with 14 doctors and nurses in Trauma Room 1. In 1997, Douglas Horn and T. Jeremy Gunn, who are on the staff of the Assassination Records Review Board, interviewed me at my office in Houston, and they brought copies of the autopsy photographs and drawings, and I made drawings of the wounds as I remembered them, and they also tape recorded my interview. And this is what I drew for them, and this is my recollection. This is the standard anatomical plate of the back of the head, and I recall a wound here through which I thought the cerebellum, and I told people that I thought I had seen the cerebellum, my friends at the time, and that the bullet had gone this way and exited that way. Next slide. Here. And this is where I saw the blasted out bone. This was clearly an exit wound of bullet fragments and the explosive contents of the brain driven out by the tremendous pressure that develops in a skull when a bullet is fired into it. Now, are there problems or discrepancies? Yes, there are. In looking at the photographs, at least that are available to me, of the back of the head, I cannot clearly see an entrance wound in the occipital area. In 1972, Dr. Wecht was the first pathologist to examine the autopsy records in the National Archives, and he pointed out, is a really very fine article, that the occipital area shows a small area in the lower scalp which has a blemish. It's sort of a reddish mark. Could this possibly be an entrance wound in the scalp that had been cleaned and combed, the hair combed down? Possibly. Dr. Baden is going to talk to us, and the Clark panel and the House Select Committee panel that he chaired identified an area higher up near the so-called cowlick that could conceivably be an entry wound. But I would say for myself, I would like to have the opportunity to see whatever photographs still are available to try to make my own mind up.
From Parkland Hospital, JFK's body was taken by Secret Service agents in violation of Texas state law at the time, back to Love Field for the flight aboard Air Force One to Bethesda Naval Medical Center, where the president's autopsy was to be conducted that night by Drs. James Humes and J. Thornton Boswell, career naval pathologists who had never performed a gunshot wound autopsy in their entire careers, and Dr. Pierre Fink, an Army pathologist called in a little bit late. A botched procedure from start to finish. JFK's autopsy has been even criticized by such longtime Warren Report defenders as my old friend and forensic pathology colleague, Dr. Michael Bodden, seen here addressing this very matter in 2003.
Among the errors that were made in the autopsy, of the many errors, was number one, nobody said, hey, we need a forensic pathologist here. When we asked Dr. Humes about that, and I must say in front that Dr. Wecht was, as he said yesterday, was not in that questioning, because Dr. Blakey didn't invite Dr. Wecht to that session because Dr. Humes wouldn't come if Dr. Wecht came, because Dr. Wecht had properly criticized the autopsy report. And that was a mistake on the part of the commission, but Dr. Humes may never have testified if that didn't happen. Among the things that we saw, just the x-rays that were taken were pressed, one of them, a critical one, is pressed up to the naked light bulb and partially melted away. Nobody called Dr. Perry or any of the people in Parkland Hospital to find out what had you done to the president in the emergency room. That's why the perforation in the neck was missed by Dr. Humes and Dr. Boswell, because there was a tracheostomy performed through it, and they didn't appreciate it. Medical examiners would. Proper forensic pathologists would examine the clothing. Where are the perforations in the clothing? They would do a complete autopsy. There was not a complete autopsy done here. The wound, the first wound in the upper back, was not tracked out. So we have an opinion as to what happened, but it wasn't because a dissection was done to see exactly how that wound proceeded.
It was at Bethesda Naval Hospital, of course, that the gruesome but now widely known photos and x-rays of the president's naked supine body were taken. Questioned among many researchers for their authenticity, they nonetheless provide important pieces of the puzzle, even when taken at face value. Here is Dr. Gary Aguilar, a board-certified ophthalmologist, long-time private Warren Commission critic researcher, analyzing a key discrepancy in the radiological evidence at the 40th anniversary conference conducted at Duquesne University in 2003.
And so in their conclusions, they wrote that several factual matters, which I'd like to examine in detail because it's not terribly readable perhaps for people in the back of the auditorium. Let's go into them in some detail. They wrote that, as a first order, they wrote that the absence of metallic fragments in the left cerebral hemisphere or below the level of the frontal fossa on the right side, together with the absence of any holes in the skull to the left, and so on and so forth, eliminate the possibility of a projectile having passed through the head in any direction from back to front. So let's look at some of their assertions. First of all, they wrote that both of JFK's lateral skull x-rays were left lateral. Now the guy who did the x-ray review was the chairman of the Department of Radiology at Johns Hopkins, Russell Morgan. You can't get better credentials than that. So he tells us that both x-rays were left lateral. Well, they weren't interested in the case because one x-ray is left lateral, the other is right lateral, and you didn't have to be the head of Hopkins to know that. On a lateral x-ray number 2, this fragment formation, and they're talking about a trail of fragments through the skull, if you extend the long axis, it extended posteriorly and it passes through the above-mentioned hole. Now, they're talking about, they've moved the hole up to the top of the head, and they say that trail fragment lines perfectly up with it, okay? Turns out that the trail fragment lies at least 5 centimeters higher than that, according to the House Select Committee on Assassinations radiologist, and according to my own viewing of the original x-rays in the National Archives. And so if you follow that trail, it doesn't extend back to the so-called entrance wound at the top of the skull. Thirdly, they say there are no metallic fragments on the left side and the lower portion of JFK's skull x-rays. Well, the first person to prove them wrong about this was Cyril Wecht, who looked in there and said, yes, there are in fact fragments on both the left side and the lower portion of the skull x-rays. And finally, just to the right of the cervical spine, several small metallic fragments are present in this region of the x-ray. In other words, they said there's some metallic fragments in the lower x-ray. Now, this is the chairman of the Department of Radiology saying this. It turns out that all of the HSCA consultants, and even me, an ophthalmologist who does look at a lot of x-rays but certainly is no radiologist, all the radiology consultants said that those little fragments down there aren't bone, aren't metal fragments, they're x-ray artifacts. So it appears they weren't looking very carefully. Now let's just examine this one business about the trail, because this is a very important one. In the autopsy report, it says the trail of fragment goes from the low entrance wound to the skull, which is back here near the EOP, to around the orbit. Well, there's no trail of fragments there at all, but that's in the autopsy report as what the x-rays show. And then the Clark panel and other people later said that the trail of fragment goes right to this higher point here, which is where the entrance was supposed to be. It's hard perhaps for some of you to see, although it's more visible on my laptop. There are some fragments up here, and if you look at the original, you do see what is a kind of a loose trail of fragments running along the top of the skull, as the House Select Committee concluded, at least 5 centimeters above that hole. So, but the important thing was they wanted the evidence to fit. They had decided that this is going to be still dispositive of shots from behind, and so you had to have the bullet fragments lining up with the entrance wound that they were supposing was there, and so then all of a sudden the fragments do line up, even though, even to a non-radiologist, even to anyone in this room, you can see they don't line up, and you don't have to have a PhD or an MD or a JD or any advanced degree.
Beyond the photos and x-rays, one of the most important pieces of medical evidence in this case was, and remains, the president's brain. Supposedly, it was to have been examined in his formal fixed state a couple of weeks after the autopsy by Humes and Boswell. However, it was not serially sectioned, the standard method for tracking gunshot wound trajectories, in order, the report said, to, quote, preserve the specimen, unquote. And where did that preserved specimen end up? As I discussed at the 50th anniversary conference at Duquesne University in 2013, not where it was supposed to have ended up.
And then we have them going to the lab 2 weeks later. Brains are fixed. I'm going to show you in a moment. A brain that has been traumatized. It might be from a spontaneous, naturally occurring intracerebral hemorrhage. It might be from being hit over the head with an axe in a motor vehicular accident or shot. A brain is as much a very thick, viscous liquid as it is a soft solid. If you tried to examine that brain properly in that condition, you would not be able to trace out the trajectory of the bullets. So what we do is we fix them for 2 weeks or more in formalin. 2 weeks is the minimum. You suspend it and you place it in a formalin solution, which is a fixative that is used in hospitals for surgical specimens sent down from the OR to the pathologist for examination. And then you go back, and now the brain, and I don't mean to be indelicate and sensitive, but for you to understand, in that fresh condition, it would have the consistency of a well-done soft-boiled egg. 2 weeks after fixation in formalin has the consistency of a well-done hard-boiled egg, and you would slice it just as you were slicing a hard-boiled egg, and then you lay out the sections, and I'm going to show you. Well, guess what? In this case, of course, they did not do that. They said, and the autopsy report so indicates, serial sections of the brain are not made in order to preserve the specimen. Here, I must disagree with my old friend and colleague, Bob Groden. He may be right. I don't know that I'm right. But as to whether or not the brain was taken by the Kennedys and buried with the body, when I went down there as the first non-government forensic pathologist given access to the autopsy materials at Smithsonian National Archives, I saw the inventory, so to speak, in April of '65, when this executive order, this cockamamie executive order, was issued that everything belonged to Jacqueline Kennedy, everything, including Connolly's clothing, the bullets, the fragments, the x-rays, the pictures, the rifle, everything belonged to her. Well, she was the last person in the world that would ever even want to look at that stuff, let alone possess it. And that was done for a constructive transfer to be made, as we refer to in the law, so that it would be given back to the government. And on October 29, '66, 1.5 years later exactly, they go back, 2 of the pathologists and 2 other people, and they do their inventory. So that's when I was down there in 1972, and I'm comparing the 2 inventories, and I see that the container holding the brain and various other things, photos, x-rays, microscopic tissue slides that were used to examine to differentiate between entrance and exit, they're no longer there.
As you can see, the mystery continues. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Exhuming JFK. For more detailed information concerning this topic, please visit HistoryExhumed.com, where you will find collection quality DVD sets of both the 40th and 50th anniversary symposia, as well as downloadable presentations and panel discussions by individual experts. You will also find my books on this subject, in particular, The JFK Assassination Dissected, Cause of Death, and Tales from the Morgue. All of these are available on Amazon and in many fine bookstores. I hope you will continue to follow all of the Exhuming JFK podcasts. I shall welcome your comments.